Hey, what's up guys? My name is Michael Westbrook. As always, thank you for checking out this video. Today we're going to talk about a couple ways that you can get the most out of your tube amp. I recently built this. It's a Marshall 18 watt clone from Trinity Amps. It uses 6v6s in the power amp section, and I'm still getting to know the amp. I'm still kind of dialing it in and getting it to sound how I want it to. Now, the amp already sounds incredible, and so kind of what I'm talking about is that last 5%. That last little bit of something just to get it exactly sounding like I want it to. Now, I've talked about this previously in other videos, but one of the biggest things that you can do to make your amp sound different or better in a way is to change out the speaker. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'm also going to talk about something probably not as drastic as changing out the speaker, but tubes. We're going to talk mainly about preamp tubes and how kind of experimenting with different types of preamp tubes can give you an even better sound, or a sound closer to what you're looking for. Currently, this amp has a Celestion greenback. It's a UK made 16 ohm speaker. That sounds great. I love greenbacks. And I will say for channel 1, I really like the speaker in this amp. It sounds fantastic. Channel 1's a little darker, and the greenback has a great brightness to it that I feel like really pairs well with channel 1. But channel 2 is a little on the bright side, especially when using single coils. So before I try to mod the amp or change anything internally about the amp, I'm going to change out the speaker. I'm hoping that with a speaker change that channel 1 still sounds as good as I want it to and sounds like I want it to, but maybe I can tame down some of the brightness in the amp. To do this, I'm going to be changing it out for a creamback. It's the M65 version. I've had that in my matchless for a little while, but I just put the H version of the creamback in that amp, which I'm really liking so far, and so I have this the M version of the creamback sitting around, and I think it'll pair well with this. It's kind of a greenback style speaker, but it's supposed to be a little darker. I was really surprised after listening back to the clips that they're not drastically different. The greenback is a little brighter, the creamback is a touch warmer and smoother, and really kind of accomplishes what I was going after. I love the greenback sound. I just wanted something that was a little smoother on the top end that gave me a little bit more flexibility with the EQ of channel 2. But I think I'm going to be able to get the brightness that I want out of channel 1 as well. I think the greenback sounds a little more papery or something in the high mids, which is a great sound. And I think if that speaker had, a few more years on it, it might smooth out even more. But for now, the creamback sounds great and I'm really happy with it. In the clip, the EQ on the amp was set exactly the same. I could see myself maybe brightening it up a touch with the creamback. And it gets me into a little bit more usable range for the treble control on channel 2. A couple of things to think about when you are thinking about changing out speakers in an amp. One, you always want to make sure that the ohm rating is, something that your amp can handle. Some amps maybe only have an 8 ohm output, so you need to make sure that you get an 8 ohm speaker, as well as the wattage. I try to not get a speaker that is, exactly the wattage rating of an amp. Say you have a 30 watt amp, I'm probably not going to get a 30 watt speaker because if I really crank the amp, there's a chance that it could blow that speaker. That's not to say that you can't do that, but just for me, I try to get a speaker that is rated a little higher than what the amp can can do, because typically when you crank an amp up all the way, it's probably going to put out a little more than what it says it's rated for. Another thing to be mindful of is the efficiency of the speaker. Some speakers are going to be more efficient. They're going to make an amp louder, whereas some are going to make the amp softer. Now, you can use this to your advantage if you are looking to make a loud amp a little quieter, or an amp that maybe doesn't have quite enough headroom. Get a really efficient speaker, and it's going to help that amp be a touch louder. That might help you in a live situation where you need just a little bit more volume. For instance, the top end of that spectrum, the most efficient speaker or the loudest speaker would probably be rated about 101 dB or maybe 100 dB, whereas a less efficient speaker typically maybe in that 96 to 97 dB. Those are some kind of common values that you'll see there. I believe the greenback is 97, so it's a little less efficient. It's going to shave a couple of dBs off the Marshall, and the greenback is actually rated, I think, the same, which is convenient for me. But if I needed a touch more headroom out of the amp, I could look for a speaker that was 100 dB rated for the efficiency, that was going to make it a little louder and help it punch through a little more. I will say, when you're looking at speakers, it can be tough to know, what a speaker is going to sound like. It's a lot of trial and error. I have boxes of speakers that I'm constantly changing in and out and trying. And so that's helpful, obviously, but not everyone can do that. I think a lot of us tend to go look at the charts, what the frequency response of a speaker is, and those can be helpful, but I also find that they can be a little misleading. I believe it was on the greenback and the creamback charts. I remember looking at those, and they would lead me to believe that the greenback was warmer and the low mids, but that's not really how it comes across when you take a listen to the actual speakers. So they can help guide you slightly, the frequency response charts, but they're not always going to tell you what a speaker is going to sound like. And sometimes you just have to try it. The next thing we're going to talk about in getting the most out of your tube amp is preamp tubes. Now, we can't cover everything when it comes to preamp tubes, but I'm going to hit a few highlights before we dive a little deeper. Most guitar amps use a 12AX7 in its preamp section, and the nice thing about this is that there are several variations that can be changed out to get different types of sounds. You might be familiar with a 12AT7 or a 12AU7, a 12AY7, or even a 5751. Now, the biggest thing to know about these tubes is that they are different amounts of gain. So if you have an amp that you want less gain out of, or a little more headroom, changing out for one of these versions might be an option for you. Another thing that some manufacturers are doing is they're creating tubes that maybe have a little bit different EQ footprint. An example of this would be the JJ ECC83MG. They call this a mid-gain version, and they say that the mids are a little fuller, a little richer in this tube. So experimenting with a tube like that could be another way to, tweak your tone and get something that you're looking for. Again, I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but we will listen to a comparison of two different tubes that kind of sit at the ends of the spectrum, just that are the furthest away from each other, just to give you an idea of how much they change the sound. Now we're going to talk about a few tips just to help you along your journey of trying different tubes and knowing where to start. There are a couple places that are going to make the most impact when you change out preamp tubes, and these are going to be what we call V1 and the phase inverter. So if we're looking at an amp like this is the Marshall. I've pulled it out of the cabinet. V1 is typically going to be the first tube that your guitar signal hits. And most likely it is going to be the tube closest to your input jack. Now, because V1 is the tube that your guitar signal hits first, generally speaking, it's going to make the most difference in your sound. So typically when I'm changing out tubes, this is where I start. I'm going to change out tubes in that first position first to see how they impact the sound. And most of the time that's where you're going to hear the most difference between different tubes. Now, the next place that you're going to hear the most difference is what they call the phase inverter, and typically this is the last preamp tube before it hits the power amp section. It's typically going to be the preamp tube closest to the power amp tubes. A lot of the differences that you're going to hear in preamp tubes and the different positions has to do with the design of the amp. Obviously, I can't cover every amp, But generally speaking, V1 and then your phase inverter or that last preamp tube is where you're going to hear the most difference. Now, I've been trying a lot of different tubes in this amp as well as my other amps. I've kind of been in this phase of trying different tubes and buying different tubes to try, and I kind of landed right back where I started. Some of my favorites are Tungsol 12AX7s as well as the JJ 12AX7s. And then I also have a few different types of tubes. And this one in the phase inverter, I'm using a Sovtek 12AX7 LPS. And this is basically a long plate tube. Now, JJ also makes some long plates that I have in other amps that sound incredible. And the cool thing about a long plate 12AX7 is that they usually have really rich harmonics. They're really usually very open and just, they sound really good. The downside about them is that they're more susceptible to going microphonic and getting ringing, especially in combo amps. You might not be able to use a long plate 12AX7, but it's worth trying, especially if you're using heads. It's worth trying in V1 or in your phase inverter. You know, for me, I found actually using the long plate in V1 in this particular amp, it almost gave me too much top end. It was almost too open, but I found using a long plate tube like the Sovtek and the phase inverter, you know, really gave me something special. It really took things up a notch. Now, I have found in comparing the Sovtek to the JJ that the Sovtek does have some richness in the low mids that the JJ doesn't. The JJ is much more open and in a way more harmonically rich. But again, because of this amp and its brightness, especially in channel 2, I didn't necessarily want that sound. Another thing that we haven't talked about when it comes to preamp tubes is buying new old stock tubes. And while most new old stock tubes that I've tried sound really good, it's just not worth it for me. It's been rare that I've tried a new old stock preamp tube that really blew me away. And felt like it was actually worth the money. So for me, I tend to stick to new tubes. Again, JJ, Tungsol, Electro Harmonics, Sovtek. Those are some of my favorites. Not to say that there aren't other manufacturers that make great tubes, but those are the ones that I've landed on. Now we're going to take a listen to two tubes that I feel like sit at opposite ends of the spectrum, the Electro Harmonics and then a JJ. Both of these are 12AX7s, so they should be in kind of a similar range of gain. We're going to take a listen to them in V1 in this amp. I realized when I was making these clips that there's really not a ton of difference in this particular amp in V1 between these two tubes, which to me is really interesting because I did the same thing in my Tweed Deluxe in the phase inverter position, and they were drastically different. The EH was a way brighter tube. It made the amp a lot brighter, and for that amp actually sounded really good. It gave it a little more brightness, and the JJ was really dark and warm. So it just goes to show you really have to experiment with these with your amp. Try different positions. You know, V1 and the phase inverter are where I typically hear the most difference, but try all the positions. Try different types of tubes. Try mixing and matching different brands and, you know, different gain levels of tubes, and just see what happens. That's going to do it for this video. As always, thank you for watching. Obviously, I can't cover everything in this video, so if you have any specific questions, definitely leave me a comment below. I'll do my best to answer those the best that I can. When it comes to speakers and preamp tubes, it's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of trying different things to figure out what works with your setup. So don't be afraid to try different things, especially when it comes to preamp tubes. It's fairly inexpensive. All right, again, thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you out there.